Crowdsourcing has been integral to research, and no other place is better for finding test subjects than Amazon's Mechanical Turk. A new article in Science says that psychologists are becoming more and more dependent on Mechanical Turk subjects. Just last month, research subjects from Mechanical Turk completed 230,000 tasks on their computers in 3.3 million minutes. That's over 6 years worth of data. How important is Mechanical Turk to social science, Kiki?
Well, it's becoming more and more important. One of the big problems in social science is actually finding subjects. And I actually worked in a lab at one point where we had to put out an ad in a physical newspaper that hopefully somebody picked up at a cafe to read and then decided, hey, I'm going to call this number and find out if I can be a test subject, right? So it's not easy to get all the people you need for your study. And the Mechanical Turk that Amazon has put together has actually allowed researchers to harness a huge pool of people. And since the Mechanical Turk stuff got going and started becoming used by researchers, we now have more than 1,000 researchers that have registered experiments using it on Turk Prime. And so there's Turk Prime, and then there is another part of the platform in which researchers actually are writing their own apps. And so it's SciTurk is what they're using there. And so there's a researcher named, Todd Garekis. He's a psychologist at New York University. And he basically says academic research would be really screwed if Amazon decided to shut it down. So there's a big question now from researchers going, hey, this is an amazing bucket of people that we can access, but it's a commercial property, and it's really up to Amazon whether or not they keep it going. And if they cancel it, if they decide it's not worth the money at some point, then what? What are the researchers going to do at that point? But it's a pretty interesting that Amazon has estimated that MTurk has more than 500,000 Turkers from around the globe.
Not twerkers.
Not twerkers, but
okay, maybe.
All right.
Maybe. I'm sure if you needed a twerker, you could find one on Amazon Turk.
And so researchers have been trying to figure out whether or not that number is accurate, because there is a problem with, you don't want somebody coming into your study and then coming into your next study and being a subject and being used over and over and over again. Because when people become professional subjects for studies, it does introduce a certain amount of bias into your data set. So it's better to try and figure out what the actual sample size is to figure out how many people they're really pulling from. So researchers know that Amazon marks the Turkers with an ID that's buried in the code after a work session is completed. And so they've been able to use those IDs, and they're using a wildlife ecology method that's called capture-recapture, that's usually used to estimate the number of animals that there are, let's say fish in a lake or birds in a forest. You go out and you capture individuals, you mark them, and then you put them back in the wild. And it's really interesting. Smaller and slower changing populations usually end up with a higher proportion of recaptured animals. And so they basically did this using the IDs that Amazon gave the Turkers, and they've discovered that not 500,000, but more likely around 30,000 subjects over about a 3-year period. They've discovered that the number of Turkers that are probably willing to take part in an experiment at any one time is about 7,300. So it's much smaller than the 500,000 workers that Amazon initially estimated. The interesting thing here is, though, that the population does turn over after about 7 months. So there are people leaving the population and fresh workers, Turkers, coming in about every 7 months.
Well, it's interesting because there must have been a fair amount of bias in the way they used to do this. I mean, if you went to college, and you needed to have some extra money, you would go in and do studies and get paid for it. Then your bias was you were a college student.
And this basically what they're finding is that this population is kind of like that. In college, you have people coming into the population and going out, but it's a very small overall population. And that's what Garekis says. He says what seemed like a virtually infinite subject pool was in fact more like a very large state university psychology pool. So it's not as good as they had hoped, but it still is a an extra population of people that they don't have to put as much work into finding. And so as a researcher, that's kind of the one big benefit.
And do they have to pay them as much? I mean, is that different, the amount of pay they get?
Yeah, so that's a question right now. They're having issues estimating what people are actually getting paid because Amazon takes a cut of between 20 to 40%. And then Turkers very often aren't just doing one study, they're signing up for lots of experiments and actually undertaking a lot of tasks at the same time. So the researchers maybe are doling out somewhere around $4 to $8 per hour. But when you're on a college campus, maybe what you're getting paid is $8 to $10 an hour. So the online work is not as equally paid as physical in the lab work. And that's something that does need to be fixed.
And what about privacy? I mean, is your Mechanical Turk login linked to your Amazon account?
Yes. So it is possible. Researchers in 2013 showed that you can actually link the two numbers, so the Amazon account and the Turk number, which is not necessarily good for privacy either.